There's been some recent talk about this Chevron doctrine that has been overturned by the Supreme Court. And I wanted to give an overview of what it is and some implications and how it pertains to our First Amendment right to free speech. What I find interesting is this clip from Kamala Harris.
It's privileges and it should be taken down. And the bottom line is that you can't say that you have one rule for Facebook and you have a different rule for Twitter. The same rule has to apply, which is that there has to be a responsibility that is placed on these social media sites to understand their power. They are directly speaking to millions and millions of people without any level of oversight or regulation.
Effectively, what the Chevron doctrine did was empowered federal agencies to interpret their own language in their regulation and enforce it. So now that Loper Bright Enterprises versus Raimondo effectively eliminated the Chevron doctrine, we have now the courts have a responsibility to interpret the regulation that our federal agencies have. For example, with Department of Homeland Security, they came out with a bulletin in 2022 that criminalized malmis and disinformation in relationship to environmental, political, and health. So those that disagree with the United Nations 2030 climate crisis will be guilty of malmis and disinformation. Those that disagree with COVID or how it was handled would be guilty of malmis and disinformation. But here's the caveat, and this was the clear overreach. Those that are guilty of malmis and disinformation are also or can be charged with domestic terrorism. That's absurd. Not only does that kind of regulation inhibit free speech, it's like, ideas. When ideas are publicized in a public forum, they kind of percolate to the top. The great ideas do. Whether it's bad or good, if we suppress or censor any bad or good idea, then the natural response is for people not to publicize their ideas, especially if you criminalize them. This is the very intent of the U.S. Constitution. The way our forefathers framed it was that ideas are litigated in a public forum. Our government not only does not have the right, they don't have any legal standing to suppress or censorship our First Amendment right to free speech. And for the Department of Homeland Security to do it in spite of this clear overreach and violation of the U.S. Constitution is absolutely irresponsible. So clearly, Kamala Harris in this context, in this interview, has no idea what the Constitution is or free speech, and clearly wants to continue the overreach that she thinks is necessary for her to do her domestic regime change. Whoever pushes this mismal and disinformation, to me, has no respect for the U.S. Constitution or those who have sacrificed so much to preserve it. If we've learned anything the last 4 years, we've learned that the executive branch will politicize their efforts to suppress and censor our First Amendment right. Look at the FBI and how many violations they have through the FISA courts. Almost 300,000 violations. This, to me, will only continue under a Kamala presidency, including the weaponization of our federal agencies. This is why this year's presidential election is so important. We essentially have two choices that are on the ballot. We have a Kamala Harris interpretation of the U.S. Constitution, which is to pursue censorship and suppression of our First Amendment right to free speech, or we have a Donald Trump interpretation of the U.S. Constitution, which is effectively allowing us to voice our opinions and and have those opinions be heard without criminalize them or allowing federal agencies to charge us with domestic terrorism. Mr. Ramaswamy elaborates how we can effectively clean up our executive branch in this video.
The Supreme Court has now given us the path to actually do it in a rock-solid way. You got West Virginia versus EPA, probably the most important Supreme Court case of our lifetime in 2022, that said that, you know what, if they write a regulation, the EPA, SEC, FTC, whatever, if they write a regulation that Congress did not authorize them to write, then that regulation is per se null and void if it deals with a major question. That's a big deal. Then you got this year, Loper Bright, the case that actually overturned what's known as Chevron deference.
Yeah.
Big freaking deal for the country. This is a big freaking deal for the country, which says that courts no longer defer to the judgments of these agencies. Then you got SEC versus Jarkissi. There's a whole bunch of other cases which says, actually, a lot of people don't know this. A lot of these administrative agencies have a judge, jury, executioner, investigator, prosecutor, rule writer, all under one roof. Separation of powers is a myth. Jarkissi overturned that and said these administrative law judges are actually unconstitutional. Just like West Virginia versus EPA said the regs are unconstitutional, Jarkissi now says that the judges themselves, the so-called judges within these administrative agencies, if they sit within the three-letter agency, their judgments are outside the bounds of the Constitution and therefore null and void. That's a big deal, and we only got that in the last couple of years.
That's true.
So that toolkit did not exist in 2017 in a way that it does today. Now, does that guarantee that any given person who's running for U.S. president that even has made explicit promises, right? I made promises on the campaign trail if I was the next U.S. president that I was going to get in there and fire 75% of federal bureaucrats. Shut down the ATF, the FBI, the U.S. Department of Education. You go straight down the list. Food and nutrition services. We don't need a lot of these agencies. And yes, I would have kept those promises if put in that position. But given the choice now, okay, yes, it didn't happen before, but you have the Supreme Court, justices appointed by Trump to do it, and a guy who actually does want to drain the swamp, my best advice to the country is take the shot you have. And if you're a libertarian, you don't agree with 100% of the views, fine. Take the shot you have to take the next step over the next 4 years, and then we've got the next 250 years after that.